What is going on, everybody? This is AJ, your host of the Bluetogreenpodcast. I just wanted to say thank you very much for tuning in and listening and subscribing. If you haven't, please do. I know that is so cliche to always talk about like and subscribe, but it really does help me out. It helps the channel out. And again, I'm just trying to get education out there to people and have interesting conversations that I hope you all find useful. On this episode, I sit down with Julie Gunnigle. Julie is a political activist. She is a former prosecutor out of Chicago, and she's a lawyer here in Phoenix, and she's a political candidate. On this episode, we sit down and we talk about everything regarding the law, regarding what's going on cannabis, local politics and all that side, on all that type of stuff, the militarization of law enforcement, just a host of topics regarding the law. And it's been fun to get to know Julie over the last several years, especially when you see and hear all of the crap that gets said about people. But then when you actually stop listening to the news and you get to know somebody, you get to know and understand and how good of a person that is and what their heart is like. And that's the fortunate part that I've had, particularly regarding Julie. So she's been controversial in the past, and it's fun and I enjoy it. But, and I love hearing other people's perspective, especially ones that I don't fully agree with. And one of the things that Julie and I respect about each other is the fact that we don't agree 100% politically, but that's okay. We can sit down and we can talk and we can have conversations. But that's what my entire point of this podcast is to bring people together of every different, political spectrum and, all that stuff. So sorry for the rambling, just getting back into this. And just wanted to say thank you very much. I hope you tune in. I hope you subscribe and like. And I know it's cliche to say that, but it does help me out. It does help my channels out. It does help spread the message and awareness. So thank you very much, everybody. I will put my contact information in the bottom. I will put Julie's contact information in the bottom, as she is still a current working attorney here in Phoenix. And thank you very much, everyone. Take care.
He threw some things out of the car right there. He's throwing some things out the passenger side. They're along the wall, the slow lane wall. 619, he's throwing dope out the window. We got bills of marijuana coming out.
619, I copy bills of marijuana coming out of the window at 2328.
We're good to go.
I can't believe we're finally doing this. That's awesome.
It's been in the work for about 2 years now.
Yeah, just about.
Yeah, we've been talking about it and just timing and scheduling. And then obviously you had a thing going on where you were trying to run for something. So, timing and everything needed to happen. So
just a bit.
But ladies and gentlemen, Julie Gunnigle.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for doing the drive down here. How are you?
I'm spectacular.
That's good.
I mean, I'm sad, defeated, angry at the government and the process, but personally, I'm doing great.
That's awesome. The one thing that when I very first was introduced to you, we've known each other for about 3 years now. Mm-hmm. And it's the sort of thing where I didn't know you before. One, I live in Pinal County, so I wasn't really concerned with Maricopa County. So this is not meant to be rude, but I didn't care about that election. It wasn't my thing. So I didn't really read up on you or anything like that. So I don't give a shit about all the stuff. I got to know Julie. I got to know Julie, who I worked with, because we are both on the board of Arizona Normal, which I've just been absent from for the last couple months because of my back. But I got to see you in action, and I got to know you personally, and I got to know your family, and I got to know your husband, and I got to see you and work with you and see how you are and how you're relevant and you're staying current with what's going on. And again, thank you so much for coming down here so we can just discuss what the fuck is wrong with the world nowadays.
That's our favorite topic when you and I get together.
Right? Everything appears to be falling apart everywhere.
It's so true. And I think that was one of the big bonding experiences with you. Because I remember I was very heavily lobbied to join the board. Okay. Like to the point where like multiple people were calling me multiple times a week saying, hey, can you just come see what we're all about? Like, let's talk. And you were kind of absent from those conversations. Right. And then
I wasn't on the board yet.
That's right.
I wasn't. You and I were.
That's right.
I had been having conversations for a little bit longer, but I wasn't on the board. We got voted on at the same time.
Yes.
So we were both different at different time, or the same time, but different conversations.
And then I remember there was a thing in Ryan's backyard, and we got talking about corruption and laws and the way things ought to be. And I just, Yeah, I have tremendous respect and admiration for you, and it's so fun to work with you.
It's the feeling is very, very mutual, and I've always been privileged enough to say that that Julie Gunnigle is my friend, and I mean that, and I've always meant that, and it's the sort of thing where when I say that to some people, they're like going, "You know Julie Gunnigle?" I'm like, going, yeah, I do. She's been at my house. We've had dinner together. Like, it's a thing. So it's been interesting to see both sides, because you're controversial at times. You know, it's just been fun.
I like that word, controversial.
Right.
Yes, that is an understatement at times too.
Polarizing sometimes.
Well, yeah. I mean, I almost feel like in this moment that if you're not polarizing, like the truth is polarizing, like that's the thing.
Yeah.
And the moment people start to understand like what's really going on, what's been hidden behind all these different power structures for a very long time, I think it is really eye-opening and polarizing, and it is a challenge to the status quo.
Agreed. I don't want to jump too far. I just want a real quick summary of just you, like what got you into the law. You're obviously a lawyer here in Arizona, like just kind of that real brief background of who you are and what your credentials are and all that.
It's actually kind of my backstory is kind of strange. Born and raised here in Phoenix, daughter
Nice.
of a public school teacher and a small business owner. My kids, we moved back to Arizona after being in the Midwest for about 10 years. I'm actually raising them in the exact same community that I grew up in.
Nice.
But I went to college for a degree in chemistry, actually.
Okay.
Because I loved the idea that there was some sort of grand unifying theory of like the way the world works.
Okay.
Like I'm at heart like a really curious person. I also really like explosions, so chemistry was like A+. This is great. And then spent some time like learning what that actually looked like in practice and learning that I don't want to spend my life in a lab. So I went to law school and thought I was going to be doing things with scientists, thought I was going to be a patent attorney.
Interesting.
No, terribly not interesting.
Okay.
We're actually worst experience imaginable, because those are folks who largely on the transactional end just sit behind a desk all day.
Not a lot of people skills.
I love people.
Right.
People are so fascinating.
Agreed.
And that's kind of what my pipeline was into criminal law and into trial work.
Okay.
So I spent some time working in a small county in Indiana, ended up as a prosecutor, ended up at Cook County, Illinois, where I worked in financial crime and public corruption.
That had to have been really, really interesting, because that's kind of been a notorious hotspot for corruption for the last, 100 years, Al Capone days.
It was fascinating. It was absolutely fascinating. So the Cook County State's Attorney's Office kind of takes everything on that corruption unit, takes everything that the feds don't pursue.
Okay.
And spoiler alert, in a place like Chicago, there is so much to be had. There's a lot that the feds can't and don't do.
Okay.
So,
just because of volume?
Yeah, because of volume. I think people at the state's attorney's office, this is probably going to draw some controversy,
Good.
View the feds as playing it very, very safe, like only taking those cases where it's an assured slam dunk, where there's a confession involved, where it's not going to head to trial, versus the Cook County State's Attorney's Office that I think is willing to take some more risks and hold, or at least the time, hold different people accountable.
Okay.
So I was actually on the indictment team that indicted the highest up official that the Cook County State's Attorney's Office has ever indicted. And it was for a large-scale fraud of all of these contracts that were coming out of the county's office for $24,999.
Because it didn't meet the $25,000 threshold for some probably criminal prosecuting reason?
Open bidding. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And it was almost $1 million that was taken.
So each individual little job was $24,999, $24,999, $24,999 because it didn't meet that threshold yet. I gotcha.
And they went to the most kind of eccentric group that you can imagine. That was 2 different rappers got a contract.
Really?
A baker, someone who was baking cupcakes from their apartment. Other people with political connections. It was all for communications work they were essentially no-show contracts and gifts to friends. And it ended up taking down the chief of staff and the head of comms for the county.
Okay.
And it was a pretty big deal, but it was also eye-opening, because I think people just assume that corruption is something that evil people do. And the more that you kind of delve into these sorts of prosecutions, you learn how, no, these are deeply ingrained cultural practices of organizations to be less than transparent.
What caused that? Is it the corruption that caused that to not be transparent as in hiding stuff and that's just the way we've always done it? Or was the system set up to be able to conceal it?
I think the latter.
Okay.
And just very much a culture of like, well, everyone else is doing it.
Oh, okay.
And the odds of this ever being, having any sort of sunlight or public attention paid to it, I think really just builds on this culture where people feel entitled, especially those in power.
Right.
And when I moved back to Arizona, which was I spent about 10 years in the Midwest, I started noticing the same sorts of things happening here.
Okay.
Those sorts of no-bid contracts, going to politically connected friends. And then there was a giant study of Arizona, a controversial one at that.
No. In Arizona? Arizona politics? Controversial?
That
Never.
ranked people's perceptions of the state versus other states. And we ranked number 1 in the perception of corruption.
Well, reality and perception of reality is what makes up reality. If you can't trust your public officials because you think you're corrupt, you have no trust in them whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly it. And that's, it's irrespective of party. This is about single party control of a government for a very long time.
Okay.
And I think there's big parallels between what you see happening in states like Illinois and what you see happening in states like Arizona, where you've had long-standing single party control.
And I think it could be said that both parties equally suck in their own ways.
No argument here.
Both parties. This is the thing that, like, I just can't wrap my head around. I'm a registered Republican. You're a registered Democrat. But at the same time, there is common ground. But if people can take a step back and have an objective opinion on things and say the left is doing what the right says they're doing and the right is doing what the left says they're doing, and they're both doing it to each other, and each thinks they're not doing it, but they're all doing the same damn thing, and it's all corrupt. Like, they have their little nuances here and there, and they can hide behind each side can hide behind the facade of whatever, but the fact of the matter remains that both sides are doing the same thing against each other. Because I listen to both sides on everything and go to, I've been in Democrat-led meetings and LD meetings and all that good stuff. And then on the Republican side, when I go to the PC meetings, it's the same thing. The crossfire is the exact same thing. It's very disheartening.
That's so disheartening. And I mean, I would frame it maybe just a little bit differently.
Okay.
Because I think people would be shocked how much you and I agree on.
We've had phone conversations where we're talking about corruption. It's like, we agree on this. We've never had a conversation as to how to get to places, but when the core foundation of, let's take one of the conversations we had about police corruption. Mm-hmm. We agreed, what's wrong with prosecuting bad cops? What's wrong with prosecuting corrupt cops? What's wrong with prosecuting the higher ups that are doing bad things? There should be nothing controversial about that from either side.
I think you're right about that. And if there is one change that I can make in Arizona politics or in framing and how we talk and think about these issues, I go back to, there's an Eleanor Roosevelt quote. And she says that small minds talk about people, that bigger minds talk about events, and that the great minds, they talk about ideas.
Okay.
And I would love to see a political discourse that comes back to policy, that doesn't couch it in right or left or polarizing people on either side, that just comes back to what is in the public good? What do we have evidence for?
Yeah.
And I think that's the other thing that we bonded, our drug policy sucks and is not based in evidence, is not based in the common good, and is really expensive.
The one thing I can say, though, is that my thoughts on the drug policies post law enforcement have absolutely changed. When you're in the law enforcement spectrum, all it is bad, 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 negative, negative, negative. And it's like, when you get out of that, and then obviously we're both cannabis advocates. And when I started hanging around, and there's no other way to phrase it. I'm not being negative in any way, shape, or form. When I started hanging around, the left. When I started hanging around the left, again, when you step out of your comfort zone, and again, I'm not trying to put labels on things, but there's a difference in the world. And I started meeting people who would talk about their different experiences in life, and especially with drugs. I learned, and I heard a very good quote, and I apologize who said it. It's not the drug, it's the relationship with the drug. I think it was the director of MAPS that said that. I just listened to on the Joe Rogan podcast a while ago, and and that one really hit. It was like, that's true, because I know very successful people who use recreational drugs and are very successful. Now, hopefully they can stay that way, but then you also have your drug addicts that can't escape the addiction. And I don't believe anymore in criminalizing their addiction. If they rob a house, they rob a house. If they steal something, they steal something. Is it because of the drug? Probably. Because of the addiction? Probably. But I don't believe in stacking the drug charge on top of it because they're a drug addict. Does that, that's my personal view on that.
It's not just your personal view. It is what evidence-based policy suggests.
Yeah. That
the minute that you step back and consider for a second that maybe everything that we have thought, and I mean we collectively, we as former law enforcement, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Have thought about drugs and how we've stigmatized people, how we've started with these assumptions that someone who is using lacks self-control, lacks self-efficacy, is potentially lesser than, and looked at what the science actually suggests, which is that addiction and substance use disorder in particular is an attachment disorder.
Okay.
Like that's the real answer. And, there's, about you want to talk about rats for a second?
What's that?
Oh, I love rats. Okay. So originally, some of our understandings about what happens with especially harder drugs and opioids in particular were informed by animal-based studies.
Okay.
Where they would put 2 water bottles up inside a cage.
Oh, you mean rats, like the rats?
Like the rats,
oh, okay.
I thought it was
vermin. I thought you were thinking like an acronym for like MAPS. Gotcha.
And what they found was that when offered water bottle and water that's laced with morphine, a rat will literally use the morphine bottle until it overdoses and dies.
Right.
And there have been studies that have turned that whole thing on its head and said, well, if the rat's only option is the cage, then that's exactly what will happen. But when you provide that rat with what that rat really needs, which is connection, because those are social animals,
right?
When they have food, when they have shelter, when they have relationships and, and sex,
right?
Like that Maslow's hierarchy,
and
offer them the same choice, they choose the water. And that suggests that when we talk about addiction, what we're really talking about are people who are using substances because there is not other attachments in their life. Something else is happening. And that when you start to focus on people's basic needs, what you see is that drug abuse and those sort of problematic usage behaviors absolutely plummet.
One of the things that I will stand my ground on is the fact that I will say that most drug addicts that we see is caused from trauma in the childhood. Mm-hmm. And most of the issues in our world are caused from trauma in the childhood. When you get down to the nitty gritty of why are you attempting to escape, what is the cause of, it's always trauma in the childhood. It always equated back to that. And it's one of those things where if we can deal with the trauma, if we can deal with the mental health aspect of it, we can get these people off of drugs and into successful roles in society.
See, we just solved a $1 billion problem right here on your podcast.
Mic drop. We're done.
No, that's the answer. Now we just need to get people out of that mindset that people who consume substances that are illegal need to be punished.
Right.
That is the solution, and that support isn't.
I equate it to the fact that it doesn't matter what the addiction is. Addiction is addiction, whether it's being addicted to the gym or being addicted to food or being addicted to drugs or being addicted to sex. It doesn't matter what it is. The addictive personality, again, probably comes from trauma in the childhood. It comes from the lack of positive things in their lives, the unresolved trauma, whether it's, abusive parents, alcoholic parents, drug addicts, whatever the case may be. And I'll speak from my own personal experience on this one. My unhealthy relationship with alcohol, which led to the downfall of my law enforcement career, was directly related to PTSD that I didn't know I had. If I would have dealt with the PTSD and dealt with that, it would not have gone down the path it did. But then you and I would not be sitting here right now. So it is the sort of thing where it was a blessing in disguise. So, but I was also able to pick myself up, get myself help. My family stuck by my side. My wife stuck by my side. So I had healthy people around me mentally and physically to assist me through this. And we just need to get those people, everybody else but the question remains is, how do you get somebody help that doesn't want help? What do you do with them?
I mean, that's that is the question where I think our fewest amount of resources ought to be headed, and the most resources should be headed toward prevention.
Okay.
Because it is so much cheaper. Yeah. And I am just really tired of the mythology that what we're doing right now is helpful in any sort of way. In particular, when we talk, there was a bill this legislative session, right, that upped the penalty for people who were engaged in low-level sales or possession of enough fentanyl that could be presumptive low-level sales. Okay. And the idea was when you up those sentences that someone gets a time out into our jail and prison system where they can dry out, get clean, think about what they have done, and then eventually rejoin society as productive. And I would love to kill that mythology with fire, because you and I both know it is easier to get drugs inside an Arizona prison than it is outside. Options for rehabilitation and therapy and services are nearly non-existent right now in prison. None. And then to go back to attachment, we know that people are most successful and able to live their least addictive lives when they have human connection. And what is prison is the absence of connection. It's the absence. I do, and I've said this before, I do believe that that people who commit crime, whatever the crime, and then again, I'm the serious stuff, not the low-level offenses. I do believe that prison should be paying your debt to society and coming out, with a clean slate. But at the same time, when all we're doing is teaching people how to become better criminals and go into, criminal university and drug university inside of the prisons, and we're not giving them mental health support, we're not giving them job skills, trade skills, we're not giving them anything, and they're just getting worse and worse and worse and being secluded in the hole and all that type of stuff, which just ruins their mental health. I was very fortunate that I sat down with Jesse Crossan, the second chancer, and had these types of conversations about reform. And it's like throwing people in a pit doesn't reform them. It doesn't make them better members of society. Help does. But who wants to spend that money? Why would we want to invest in that when they're just criminals? Yeah, I mean, you don't need to be a prison abolitionist to believe that there are evidence-based solutions out there that are different than putting people in cages. And that's something that, now, I will also say that I do think that there are some people that are irredeemable. I do think that there are some people that, despite all of the chances they've been given in life, they're not supposed to be out in the public realm. That's my personal opinion on, let's say, child predators, the habitual child predators who that's all they've done their entire life. I personally don't believe they should be out in public. So the thing I wonder about this, because I think we should address that question head on, but I also see the way a lot of these discussions start going, that when the moment that we start talking about rehabilitation, what it means to actually prevent crime rather than invest in these solutions that we know aren't working, it eventually devolves into this, what people think is a presumably small packet of quote unquote irredeemable people. Okay. And it worries me when 95% of the discourse is about 5% of the population. Agreed. And the 5% of the discourse on everybody else. I just can't help but to wonder when we start looking at some of these programs, some of these ways to actually invest in people that's preventative, how many fewer people end up in that 5% category. And again, child predators learned it in their childhood. It's just a revolving door. One of the things I did was child crimes. It's just a revolving door. And again, it goes back to, if we would deal with the issues as a child, stop stigmatizing mental health, and actually have good quality resources in abundance for people to go and get the help, you're right, that 5% will drop hopefully down to zero. I mean, that's the goal. I mean, and that should be the goal. The goal should be a society where people have so many different opportunities to thrive that the things that we consider as crime or harm are non-existent. Yep. And anyone who tells you that we don't have the resources to make that happen is utterly full of it. We are investing $1.6 billion into a prison system that actually houses 20% fewer people than it did 3 years ago. It has seen a ballooning budget. And we actually do know what works for a lot of folks to prevent harm, to keep them out of prison. And I would just like to see a true commitment and investment in it. And I don't see it. Well, it's the sort of thing where we can spend hundreds of billions of dollars to other countries,
We can help everybody else, but why are we not investing in these things for us here? I don't have an answer for that.
Oh, I mean, I have an answer for that. And I
military industrial complex.
No, I really think when we talk about sides, when it comes to politics, that there truly are no sides apart from the people who are getting rich off these solutions and everybody else who has to live with the consequences. Yep. And I think you especially see that when you have a heavily privatized system, and make no mistake about it, even though about 25% of our beds are privatized in the state of Arizona, all of our other prison services, even in our public prisons, are privatized, privatized commissary, telecom, healthcare. People are getting rich off
for profit.
Yep. And it's only going to get worse until we start to address the real issue, which is that capitalism incentivizes sending the most number of people to prison, such that Arizona is now the 8th largest incarcerator in the world.
So how do you manage? Now, I'm a fan of capitalism. I want people to, this is a hot topic right now, obviously, but I want people, entrepreneurs, to get rich, start companies, employ people, and then those people can start, you know what I'm saying, and just keep building. Yeah, yes, there's always going to be somebody that just has the abundance of money. How do we, I don't want to use the term equal this out, but how do we make this not so profitable? And it should be punitive. It should be rehabilitative. It should be dealing with the issues. But how do we invest that money so that it can be those things without individuals just getting rich off of a scam?
Well, I mean, I think that needs to be the first thing. Let's take private equity companies out of the picture when it comes to our true public services. Yeah. Right. And taking back those private prison beds, making sure that we have true independent accountability for our prisons. Like, this should be mind blowing. Arizona didn't always even have a Department of Corrections, even when we had a giant ballooning prison system. But it has never been under any sort of board, any sort of organization that was independent and accountable.
Even
Ever.
now. So who runs it now?
Well, it's run by a department agency head.
Okay. And that's it.
With zero independent accountability. It wasn't until this executive order that creates a committee structure around it. And that was like 3 months ago.
Oh, so
and they
this
just
is
met
brand
last
new.
week.
Okay.
And even then, you know, what we should be focusing on some of these big issues inside of our prisons. Like, it is a safety issue, the
Agreed.
Locks on these doors.
Agreed. Yeah. There's been murders that have happened because of it.
That's exactly it. We've seen overdoses spike during a pandemic. Now, that should stop everybody in their tracks for a second.
In prison? But how do you get drugs in prison if it's the best place to go clean out?
With no one visiting, like nothing coming in or out, how are we having
There's certain people coming in and out.
There you go.
Yeah. And which is corruption. So it's also the sort of thing too where those people are making pennies and they're what's the word I'm looking for here? Subsidizing their income off of selling drugs inside of the prison. Mm-hmm. And it's corruption that needs to be talked about. It's corruption that needs to be brought to attention. I don't know how to fix it, but I don't know what the answer is.
I don't have all the answers either, but I do know that the first step is being able to take a look at it and have some sunlight on the process. Yeah. And that's been one of the big issues with the Department of Corrections in Arizona, is that we've had multiple whistleblowers come forward on these issues, and they have either unalived themselves or been subject to such severe ridicule. We've had one gone missing? Like, it's absolutely wild inside this one agency. And I think the more that people get involved with Arizona politics, you realize that there's kind of these sorts of fiefdoms everywhere by virtue of so many previous administrations that just have, those sorts of friendly favors that just have, what are the words I'm looking for? Regulatory capture. Okay. That's something we talk about a lot in the cannabis field.
100%.
That you shouldn't have industry controlling their regulators. It's everywhere.
They get too friendly. I mean, look at, I know off of numbers, like off of the FDA alone at the federal side, 65% of their budget is funded by the pharmaceutical companies. So again, talking about industry, for those who don't understand that, it's like when those people are paying the salaries of the people that are supposed to be overseeing things, that creates a lot of issues, especially when you're dealing with people's lives. It's not just money, it's people's lives, people who are locked up, people who are not getting any services whatsoever.
Right. And those are things that you don't even see captured in like the current like media ecosystem, which is why I think it's so cool and so interesting what you're doing with the podcast, what we start seeing with the proliferation of these citizen journalists reporting things on TikTok, having commentary from places where we don't always hear it or where reporters aren't always primed to understand it.
Or to think independently of who their sponsors are.
Well, I mean, there's certainly that too. Oh, Lord, that's a whole podcast issue about the issues with our current newspaper of record in Arizona would just be a nice start.
Well, and when it comes to media, I don't watch anything anymore. I watch independent journalists. I lied. I do watch both. I'll watch both the left and the right. I'll watch all of them and kind of form my own opinion, but I don't ever sit down to get like the real scoop on what's going on because there's just certain agendas that are pushed and many, many things that are overlooked. Corruption is always one of the things that's overlooked. And one of the things I was going to say is like, take this person who's in charge of Department of Corrections. I had you have a civil servant heart, and I just want to do things that better people's lives. And I don't understand how these people get into these positions of power, of extreme power, and not keep that as the focus. And they're just so busy making six figures in their new bureaucratic job that they'll never get fired from. You know, that's always been my rub. It's like your job is to lead these things to better people's lives, and you're making everything worse. Oh, but you're making a lot of money.
You're making a lot of money, or you have just a little taste of power.
Yeah.
And so we're recording this during budget week.
Okay.
And I have been...
It's May 12th. So
yes.
2023.
So what is that? That budget has... I don't think is signed, but is approved by both chambers.
Okay.
And I've been an outspoken critic of the way the universal expansion of the empowerment scholarship accounts went.
The ESA?
The ESA.
I'm not 100% certain on what specifically that is. I know it's for public schools, and but if you could please elaborate.
Sure. Okay. So the program started many years ago with the idea that they were going to center the needs of children who have disabilities, children of military families who are moving around a lot, children who are in foster care, and expanded to children whose only local school option were failing schools.
Okay.
And what the program did is it provided that child with 90% of the money that your local public school would get for educating you. And it gave you a lot of options as to how to spend it.
Okay.
Whether it be using it for homeschool supplies or curricula, or taking it knowing that that money still isn't enough to fund a private school education, but it would help subsidize that. For my clients, I serve, as you know, a handful of special needs families.
Right.
This is a program that has saved their kids' lives, like literally, because when their public school doesn't serve them, and let's be real, the public schools, like my local public school has a multi-million-dollar deficit when it comes to funding special education service.
The special education side.
Yeah. And what the federal law has to say is if you can't service a special needs child in their local public school, that they have to provide you with a fully funded private option. But that takes lawsuits and years, and even like months seems forever in the life of a child.
Especially when it comes to special needs. And again, I'm a special needs parent who my son goes to a special needs school. I probably should know this, but I'm not going to lie. My wife handled all that financial stuff. I'm not going to lie on that aspect. So I should probably know what this is. But yeah, I benefit from, I'm not sure if we use ESA or just grants. So I don't know specifically.
And that's actually a side-by-side program too. Yeah. So it originally started with that idea. And for my clients, it was great because we didn't have to threaten to sue the school district to get their special needs child into a program that could actually serve them.
You could just take that ESA money and go over here and go say, hey, I'm going to take them out of this. Now, does the public school have to admit to the fact that they cannot handle the needs of the child, or is it parent discretion from the get-go?
For ESA, it was just parent discretion from the get-go, which made the process so much smoother, and it made it so that, and you had to be in public school for the first 100 days of the previous school year.
Okay.
And in my view, it was a program that was good, and it was a program that was working. I'd personally rather see special education services universally funded so I could send my kid to the school down the street, but neither here nor there. So what the legislature did last session was open it up to everyone, irrespective of whether or not their child was currently in a public school.
Okay.
And the price tag on that was supposed to be, and forgive the vagueness of the numbers, it's around $50 million. it is set next year to be a $650 million program.
Holy moly. For everybody, not just the special needs families.
For everybody.
Wow.
And it's placing my special needs families that I serve at a disadvantage because now they're waiting months to have transactions approved. The administration wasn't ready for it. It threatens to bankrupt Arizona in the same way like the alt fuels scandal did.
I remember that.
And so this is a long way of answering your question about like, well, how do people start out good and like turn to shitty politicians? Watching this budget process has left so many people frosty who voted for people thinking that they were going to be the voices of fiscal accountability, the voices of our kids, and really get down there and fight. They get a little taste of power and then they vote for a shit budget.
Why?
A little taste of power. I don't know. I don't have any answers. Even knowing some of these folks and being friends with them personally, I know that for some people, this was a really hard vote. A lot of people did vote no and wanted to go through more negotiations and more pressure and really just better public education of like the issue. And that didn't happen.
The thing you said, though, is that, you know, if your child is going to go to a failing school, then they can go somewhere else. Well, why aren't we fixing the failing school? Why does 6A division school there's a lot of kids that go to a 6A division school, and that's a very large school, and then little tiny itty bitty rinky dink podunk Arizona has no funding. Like, why does this school get brand new gym equipment every single year, or brand new this and brand new that every single year? Why can't we divert some of the funds and some of the money over to the other school? That's the type of stuff that just blows my mind. Why aren't we raising the bottom of the barrel up and helping them out and assisting those smaller schools?
Yeah, I mean, and if you talk to folks down at the legislature, what they will tell you is that there's like 5 humans in the entire state of Arizona who fully understand our, Group A, Group B funding formula and how it all works.
The rest of us are idiots.
Well, it's really complicated, but I'd suggest to you it's complicated by design and it's complicated by a policy decision a long time ago to fund schools based in part on property taxes.
Right.
And that's why we end up with these giant income disparities in affluent communities versus the communities that are the have-nots. And I'm worried about that. Like, that is literally the fundamentals of democracy, that everyone have access to education. Not that I think that there's a lot of weight to be put into founding fathers or framers or any of that. But like, literally, that's one of the things that Jefferson stood for, is like, let's fully fund a public education program. Otherwise, we're not going to have an informed populace. An informed populace can't self-govern.
Well, the argument could be made that they're trying to dumb down the population so that they can be the ruling party, whoever they may be.
And I'd suggest to you, it's not that party, it's this party.
Right. Agreed. So there's always that want power and control. And again, I still believe, as I've said a couple times now, of for and by the people. And I do think that one of the biggest problems is that we're all so tuned out to politics because we're all exhausted of politics, unless you're in the political world and all that good stuff and keeping up, that the general population doesn't really care. And they don't stay involved. They're not making, like, before I got involved with Arizona Normal, I should have been way more involved, being that I was a government worker. I should have known what was going on. But until I got involved, I had no idea, nor did I care. And then a light switch turned on, and now I'm like, oh shit, there's a lot of issues going on right now.
Well, yeah, and it's overwhelming.
It is.
And it's hard to break through all of the noise. And it feels like everybody wants to focus on like personality and the people and not the policies that they're pushing, that all of us peons have to live under.
Right.
And it's really frustrating. And to that end, I don't have any solutions for you other than, that I have almost completely tuned out anything that isn't Arizona.
Right.
Actually, so that's one of the things we talked about. Like, I'm not going to talk about anything national, because if I can maintain my hyper focus on what's happening here, that's where I'm most effective.
Well, and there's just too much going on. There's just too much going on across the world, and every day it's a new, like right now, today is the first day of the ending of Title 42. Mm-hmm. So for those who don't know, it's the immigration policies that were put into place during 2020. And it's like, now we're going to have a new influx of issues to deal with. And I'm not saying the people are the issues. I'm saying we're going to have housing issues and clothing issues and food issues and all this type of stuff. So what in the, like, how do we fix this? There's the side that says close the border completely. There's the side that says let them in. I've said this for years. It's my personal thing. I've literally said, and I did human smuggling and human trafficking and criminal interdiction. Like I did it. I know what I'm talking about on this aspect. This is my personal take is I think we should be lining everybody up and fingerprint them, identify them, get their DNA, do a criminal background check on them from their country of origin, wherever they may be, and then give them a license, or what is it, legal permanent resident card, and say, hey, be a good citizen for 3 to 5 years. Here's your taxpayer ID. Go be a good citizen for a few years, get a job, and then in that 3 to 5 year, whether it's 3 years or 5 years, then you become an American citizen. That's my personal opinion on how to solve the immigration issue, is because we'll be allowing them to go and get a job.
And I would think that if you were to put that in front of 10 Arizonans, you'd probably get the majority agreeing with you.
Right.
Now, what's frustrating to me, and again, I'm sort of tuned out of like the national sort of political scene, is as I've tried to get to the bottom of it, because I'm a naturally curious person. Right. Where can I find Title 42? Where can I look at my primary source? What does it actually say? What was the policy before that, and how was it working?
Right.
It's really difficult to find that sort of information. So when you want like a just immigration policy that treats people as humans and believes that there's no person who is illegal, and that you want that everybody to be part of an inclusive, safe, just society, like where do you get to that policy? Who's talking about that?
Nobody's talking about that. It's just keep them out or let them in. That's all it is. And I believe that there needs to be a balance of that. I'm a second generation. My grandmother was born in Italy, Sicily. I'm only second generation born in this country. So again, if the policies would have been too restrictive, I wouldn't be sitting here right now. But I also believe that and I will also say this too, that there are many, many immigrants who are attempting to come into the country right now who are being told and promised something else that other than what the reality is, just so they'll pay the money. But then there's also the ones who are being human trafficked. Like all of these issues are all happening at the same time, as well as the families that just want to come and be a better human being and get out of their issue that they're dealing with, whether it's drug cartels or they don't have jobs or money. So all of these things are happening at the same time. And now they're flowing into Arizona as well. And it's like, what are we going to do? What is the answer? I don't know.
And there, in my perception, at least on the very like local level, it's just been one side is saying this, one side is saying this. You make up your mind for yourself sort of discourse. And I think that's not helpful. One thing I can tell you about Maricopa County that I think is fascinating is that back under the reign of Bill Montgomery, who is now 2 county attorneys ago, he's now a Supreme Court justice.
Arizona Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm. He had a roundtable on human trafficking, because we know that the majority, almost 75% of humans who are trafficked into Arizona, at least, are trafficked for labor purposes. Okay. And those who are most equipped to root out those sorts of labor abuses, especially folks who are like on the ground, are those who are tradespeople, right? So you bring together like the unions, the people who are like working these jobs who can see it every single day, and with the intention not of going after people who are exploited, but the people who are doing the exploiting. You start having quality investigations that are long-term, that are meaningful, and that can bring about other policy changes. We had this roundtable. It was working. Okay. New county attorney comes in. Almost their first order of business is to end that, and that sort of coalition and that sort of cooperation.
Why? Again, it's just an open-ended question of why. Why would you do that?
Those are, you and I know, those are difficult convictions to win. Those are difficult investigations. Those take an awful lot of time. It is way easier to say that you locked up 1,000 people who consume drugs than it is to go after one human trafficker, where it will take a while to develop that case. You would have,
because you have to get the federal documentation that they are or not allowed to be in America. I've never done anything at the federal level. I've done it at the local level. But and one of the issues to me was the fact that, again, you have someone coming across from Mexico who wants to come, and a lot of 90% of my interactions were immigrants who just wanted to come and work and make a better life. But the problem was this. I remember very distinctly, I made a vehicle traffic stop. It was a gentleman who spoke broken English. He had a voter ID card from Mexico, and the truck was registered to him, and as I'm standing at the passenger side door talking to him. No threat, nothing like that. Just give me his information. He didn't have an Arizona license or anything like that, but he had registration and insurance. But there was postal mail that was on the ground, and I looked down and I saw the mail, and it was not his name. So I'm like, and I picked it up and I looked at him, and he just hung his head down. And what he was doing, this is the unfortunate part, and the bad part is that he was using someone else's identification for work. I don't call that a criminal. I call him just trying to find work, and that's what he was having to do just to be able to work in this country. And that's the part where it's like we have to fix that. It's bad he stole the identification. It's terrible for that person whose ID he stole. But if we had a system that helped this person come to this country and work, we wouldn't be having that issue. I mean, from the get-go.
So true. and to go back, I mean, it was a policy for the Maricopa County Attorney's Office for the longest time, and I believe it still is, that in those instances where someone is using an ID to pay taxes and to have gainful employment, they could be charged with a misdemeanor offense, or they could be bumped up to a felony crime that is deemed a crime of moral turpitude that makes them potentially deportable and has immigration consequences. And the county attorney's office, position from time immemorial has been, no, we're going to act as pseudo immigration authorities, making these decisions about who can be in the country through the premises of, the felony criminal law. And I think that's wrong, and I think that's damaging. And I think that if we're going to be fair and just, we need to start exploring what it would be like to have, a law enforcement office that is looking at these cases and trying to not create immigration consequences and is trying to create criminal law consequences only. And I think what people fail to realize in all this discourse is that this is still a real safety issue. I spoke to so many people when I was campaigning. One heartbreaking story of a child who was sexually assaulted, who had made a complaint, didn't want to press it because her parents lacked immigration status.
That's a problem. I understand what you're talking about. Yeah, it's the trust with law enforcement because they're scared of the immigration side of the house.
And it runs clear through every thread in Arizona. Yeah. Like we've got to tackle this issue and do it in a fair and just way if we're going to have any sort of, real public safety, real crime prevention, stopping some of this harm that's happening.
That's the question is how do you prevent these crimes? Again, going back to the wholesome, safe places, safe communities, and all that. But the current crime that's occurring it's worsening, and it's worsening in every city. But then there's studies that show, oh no, it's the safest time to ever be alive and all this good stuff. But then you see all these random attacks that are happening.
Oh, can we talk about that for a hot second?
You can talk about whatever you want. I've got time and cameras and SD cards. We can keep going. And again, it is the sort of thing where it's like, I want to pick your brain on so many things because we may not 100% agree on things, but I think you are just an absolute treasure trove of knowledge, and because you are connected and involved and relevant.
Well, thank you.
That was the one thing I've said from the beginning, is that you didn't go away and disappear. You stayed relevant. You stayed in the fight no matter what. You just kept going.
Well, and yeah, I'm going to continue to do exactly that. I think, and I want to hear your thoughts on this too, because
nobody has ever said that.
Oh, no. Can we talk about crime reporting for a second?
Sure.
So people absolutely, I think, have the impression that crime is increasing everywhere and that it's at an absolutely epidemic proportion. The numbers don't necessarily bear that out. And in fact, that there's a study that goes back of public opinion nationwide. Okay. And they found that every single year since it was like 1980, people thought that crime was increasing exponentially, with the exception of 2001, where their focus was on terrorism 9/11. rather than what we consider street crime.
Right.
And what I've always toyed with, and I don't have any good answers, is how we answer that. We know that crime reporting statistics have some big flaws, that there aren't independent auditing of what people consider a crime or a classification. Policing is a very black box of data, prosecution even more so.
I've got a number one question that I wanted to ask you. It was about law enforcement, so this is a great place, a jumping off place, but continue, please.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'd like to see, and I think the public should start demanding it, and it is nerdy, Why are we not getting disaggregated data? Like, just show us the disaggregated data of what cases are coming into, for example, a prosecutor's office, what charging decisions are made, and how those cases are pled down. Why are we not able as citizens to have access to that? Why can we not study that? Why can we not study the decision making that happens and all the discretion that's vested in police and in prosecutors, and less so in judges in Arizona? Why do we have to be so secretive? And if we were to be less secretive and more transparent about who's being charged and why, would that replace the current discourse of if it bleeds, it leads, and crime reporting being salacious?
Yeah, this is boring and nerdy, and who wants to sit and go through all of this? So why would we do that when we can just say, you know, the sensationalized news? That's you know, why nobody cares about it, is because it's not sensational and, you know, grandiose and all that stuff. And when you say can't get the information, is it just because what's only released is the pen or the outcome? That's so we don't know what's being originally charged. We only know the outcome.
And we've only known the outcome in Maricopa County, which is the 4th largest county in the country.
Right.
We've only known that outcome for 2 years when they put up their quote unquote data dashboard.
I do know from a law enforcement side, though, like what'll happen, like on the I don't want to say fudge numbers, but on the numbers that are a little bit rocky, you have a task force. Okay, you've got Phoenix, Mesa, Tempe, and I'm not. This is not an indictment on anybody. I'm just using terms. You know, Phoenix, Mesa, Tempe on an FBI task force and maybe a DE agent. So let's just throw a bunch of people in there, and they go and raid a drug house that has, you know, tons of sales and all that type of stuff. And it's a good bust, and there's, you know, 1 million fentanyl pills and all that good stuff. Here's where the problem has. Phoenix PD reports that they hit a drug house. Tempe PD reports that they hit a drug house. So all of these agencies that are on that one task force report back that they hit a drug house. So that one drug house turns into 5. So that's an issue. I do know that is an issue that gets reported up to the Uniform Crime Reporting, the UCR. So that was huge when the drop houses were huge here in Arizona. So that was huge. They'd be like, but the problem was that the drop houses were a big deal. They were a very serious threat that was happening within our communities, mostly on the west side, unfortunately. But so the numbers were fudged, but in that case, accidentally. But it also does go towards funding. Goes towards more money, goes towards more funding. Oh, task force hit 5 houses. No, it's just 1. So.
And there's a million more instances where certain departments have wanted to bump up their numbers with respect to XYZ and wanted to, because it's a really great narrative. The public understands the idea of a crackdown.
Right.
And that looks powerful, and that looks like a response that makes them feel safe.
Right.
But there have been so many instances, and I'm thinking of a few high profile ones in Chicago in particular, where nothing had changed with enforcement. The only thing that had changed was with how they were reporting on the enforcement.
Okay.
And yeah, like the uniform crime reporting needs to drop the U altogether.
Yeah, it's not uniform at all. And also not everybody's required to submit to it.
That's exactly right.
So you don't get all of the information.
Mm-hmm. And then trying to get that information and study that information is also incredibly complex and difficult.
And this goes back to transparency in the government. So I believe in I think that there's really only 2 things that should be secret, or 3 things actually, in the entire government. And then the rest should be completely open. Everything else should the FOIA request should be walking up to the window saying, hand me this, please. And they give it to you without any bullshit. But unfortunately, I've been a part of the bullshit where things have been when I was in law enforcement, they would ask for this. And because the citizens were not very, very, very specific because they didn't know, the whole report wasn't given. So the whole report wasn't given, just the synopsis. And it's like, you guys just missed 1,000 pages of a report.
Yeah, you shouldn't have to be an attorney to navigate your government.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's step 1. We're going to solve all the problems of the world today. What are 2 and 3?
We're going on down that path. No, but I do want to ask you, though, on this law enforcement, crime reduction, citizens, what do you feel, and I'm asking a personal opinion here, what do you feel law enforcement's role in society is? How do we keep our citizens safe and at the same time have a good relationship with law enforcement?
God, that's the $1 million question, isn't
Right.
it? What I personally would like to see is more evidence-based policies when it comes to policing.
Okay.
So I would like to see our politicians look at the kinds of calls that are received by the police departments every single day and make those intelligent evaluations as to how they want folks spending their time and do it transparently. We don't have that right now for a bunch of different reasons. The most primary is that, at least in the city of Phoenix, we have a weak mayor system, and that policing decisions go through the city manager, and it's like 3 layers of accountability.
Yes.
So when I hear things that, for example, that 60% of the responded to calls in the city of Phoenix right now, and I think these are like months old numbers, so please forgive the lack of precision.
We didn't, this is just conversation. We didn't come with 100% statistics. So
for what it's worth,
everybody
I think they're
forgive us.
2 months old, but that they're trespass calls.
Okay.
That they're trespass calls relating to people who are unsheltered.
Okay.
And what I would like to see is some intentional review saying, is that the best use of police time to be responding to trespass calls?
Okay.
Or is it better to follow the lead of other studied cities that have provided, for example, housing first solutions? I would like to see a intentional response when it comes to mental health as well.
Okay.
We know that in the city of Phoenix, which is again poised to be the most violent police unit in the entire country, and that it is currently under investigation by the DOJ for a host of different failings, one of which being its response to people who are in a mental health crisis.
Okay.
I would like to see welfare check calls outsourced to a different agency at caller request.
Okay. Why? Like, I haven't heard from my neighbor in 6 months. Could you go check on them? That sort of welfare checks.
That sort of welfare checks. Or my son is in crisis. He has threatened self-harm.
Okay.
What we've seen in other jurisdictions who've offloaded that as a primary response coming from police is that we've seen greater de-escalation. We've seen fewer civilian shootings, and we've seen an evidence-based mental health model that works. It is a step of building trust because, and full disclosure, I spent a lot of time in our most policed zip codes over the last year, going door to door, talking to residents about what they want in their systems. And one of the things that they said over and over was that they would never make a mental health call because they would be worried that the response would be to harm the person. And that just is such a failing of government. I can't even begin to start. So those are the 2 biggest things I'd like to see.
On that note, though, mom calls 25-year-old son who's a known schizophrenic and on drugs and everything else is in mental crisis. Okay, let's take this. No drugs, but just the mental aspect of it. But now son has a weapon. How do you deal with that? Well,
I mean, that does change things substantially. That's for when looking at the data, that's not the majority of the calls, just to be clear. But even in those instances, models like Cahoots that have come out of, it's Washington, it's Oregon, it's Colorado who started to implement these more forward-thinking policies. What they found is that trained mental health professionals who do de-escalation with people in crisis end up being more effective, and they haven't seen harm come to those people. If that's the concern, that the only way to meet force is with force, that's not what the evidence bears out. And I think it should be an option that's provided to residents. And I think it should be an option that's not tethered to police interference. So what we have right now, at least in the city of Phoenix, because people were arguing for this, it was called the No Cap program.
Okay.
And they wanted to see it funded to the tune of I think $30 million, which is a rounding error for the city of Phoenix.
Right. Yeah, they got a large bit. They got a large budget.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost $1 billion in this next budget that's going just to police out of the city of Phoenix budget. And what they wanted to see was this offloaded to a organization that was using those sorts of policies that have worked in other places. Okay. And instead, they got a further funding of, and it's not even actually implemented yet, it's taken 2 years to expand out our current system, which still continues to call police. So, for example, in an instance of a mental health crisis, we know that the comorbidity of having a mental health crisis and having a substance use issue, they're highly correlated, right? And the moment that you tell someone, well, there'll be a police response if there's a crime present, and it is a crime to have drugs on one's person or paraphernalia by one's person, is the moment that you stop being a mental health response and the moment that you start injecting like this carceral aspect to it. And that's why having a mental health practitioner respond to a mental health call, like, it works.
So you're not opposed to law enforcement showing up if there is a safety aspect of it?
Well, I think that's what the public expects. If there's a safety aspect, that's how we're using police.
Right.
But when you dig into the numbers, it's a heck of a lot less of that right now in this moment.
And I can tell you that, again, I'm dated. I'm 6 years removed, 5.5 years removed. So I can only speak from what I dealt with. And I can tell you right now that there was very few resources other than myself to respond within a timely manner to even a low-level mental health call. I'm talking, say I had somebody who was, whatever the case may be, out on the freeway, and I was there because they're on the freeway as a pedestrian, which is not a good thing. But now I've got them in my custody and off of the freeway, and they're clearly in mental health crisis. I dealt with this many, many, many times. I would call community bridges, and not because they're terrible. That's not what I'm saying. They were just overworked. It was like, we'll be there in 3 hours.
Yeah.
And my supervisor's going, AJ, you got to get rid of this guy and you got to get out because there's a rollover and there's a this and there's a that. And it's like, I'm legally responsible for this person right now. So that's been the issue, is that when law enforcement shows up, they have very, very few things that they can actually do. Okay, maybe they can de-escalate the situation, but now you still have a person who's in crisis, but they're just off of the ledge a little bit. But now what do you do with that person when you don't have robust resources?
Well, exactly. And like that's one of the feedback that I get often from police officers.
Yeah. They don't want to deal with it.
Well, and it's the same folks over and over again. And I think that is really telling. There was a project out of, I forget which California city, that's kind of started out as a model. And what it does is it focuses on like the 1% of folks who are arrested over and over again by the same department. Yeah. Identifying those folks, getting them hooked up with resources, and just seeing like, can we change that when you have so much bandwidth that's chewed up?
Yeah. By one person, by one single person.
Why aren't we doing something to change it?
Well, and because it takes money and nobody wants to fund that and nobody wants to do any of those things.
It's so frustrating.
It is very frustrating.
It's so frustrating. Yeah. And I just think that that's the piece that's also, it's just so lost in the discourse. Like, people have reduced police funding to for and against positions.
Right.
And I think that's so harmful, especially when you don't have like the data to actually look at and be like, how are folks spending their time? Is there something that we can offload that would make life easier? Are there folks that need those resources and that would produce more bandwidth for other people? Like, why are we not talking? Well, I know why we're not talking about that, but
because it's money, because it involves money. And the other thing is too, though, is that law enforcement agencies, when they can show that they've arrested so many blah, 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 or done this or done that, that goes more towards their budget. And they can also show like, look, we need more funding because of this or that. This is my take, and it's not my take. I'm not original on this. I'm copying somebody else, but I heard it and I think it's amazing. Personally, I believe that law enforcement budget needs to be increased, but with the caveat being that we're also going to hire and train officers substantially more and substantially better. I don't believe... I was 24 or 25 when I went through the police academy, which is very basic in scope. And then as you're going through your career, you continue to get continued education and, officer advanced training and all that stuff. But it doesn't include this robust constitutional law. It doesn't include this robust actually understanding the law. It teaches you how to do the job. And my personal take on this is that I was too immature. I think being 21 years old and have the authority of a police officer, you're too immature. That, again, now I'm looking back at myself saying, holy shit, I had a ton of power that I could do whatever I wanted and strip people's, rights. And I think being a law enforcement officer in this country, I think it's the most powerful position a person can have as a job, because it's the only position that can take away somebody else's rights. We have constitutionally granted rights, and it's only law enforcement that can strip those rights. And I think that we need to be hiring and training. Our training needs to be
very long. Our training needs to be very in-depth. There needs to be taught ways to control somebody in a way that doesn't automatically go to hurting or, to hurting them. But you're going to use pain as compliance, but in a controlled manner. But that's going to require way more training. That's going to require more equipment. And I had this, when I had Deputy Slope on here, we were talking about the militarization of law enforcement. I'd love to hear your aspect of this. What is your thoughts on the militarization of police?
I mean, I'm troubled and informed by the situation that played out in the city of Tempe and the city of Phoenix during the summer of uprisings, right? Where they had access to militarized equipment.
Okay.
And it was used in the most highly political way.
Okay.
And I always worry when I see military style tactics and weaponry employed against a citizenry. And in that case, a citizenry that was advocating for a particular political position against some of the folks who were wielding that power. And I do not think that there has been enough attention played on the political prosecutions that resulted in 2020.
And there was a huge thing on ABC 15 with Dave Biscobing and all that stuff regarding what this is. Are you able to say who it is you're talking about directly?
Oh yeah, I'm happy to talk directly.
Okay.
For the uninitiated, in 2020, I was running against then appointed unelected county attorney Alistair Adele, and there during that point in time, it seems from the upper echelons of her administration, they had made the policy choice to charge people who were protesting as gang members.
Right.
One of whom was facing 1.5 years for nothing more than is tipping over some pylons were literally the only thing when they rolled back the tape that they could see. And when they started looking into, what motivated those sorts of prosecutions, it was very much to shut people up, to stop protesting. And it took over a year to get those prosecutions dropped. I can't not tell you that it was that there is one organization who deserves literally all of the credit, and that is Mass Liberation Arizona, who was laser focused on making sure that these 39 people were freed, and that this was exposed. And it was one brave journalist who took on this issue.
Is that Dave?
That's Dave Biscobing. And everybody else in the scenario displayed the most outrageous political cowardice that you can imagine. Like, you and I are sitting across from each other, and I think that we can agree that prosecuting people for their political beliefs and for protest is objectively wrong. It is against every tenet that we view as fundamental to liberty.
Fundamental to the United States of America, our Constitution, and democracy 100%. That's shit that dictators do. That's shit that, Putin in Russia does. That's stuff that putting your political opponent in prison is the antithesis of democracy.
So why is it then that there were only 3 elected officials, all of whom were Democrats, but 3 out of, I don't know, we have over 100 in Arizona, who were willing to speak up about it, who were willing to say that this is wrong, don't do this. And this is like after the investigation. I think it's one thing when you're trying to make a split second, like those reactionary Twitter takes based on just press releases.
Right.
But after the investigation, after seeing the footage revealed, like that's going to be your take. Silence.
The thing
stand for something.
Stand for something. 100%. That right there is just live on your feet and don't die on your knees. And it's the sort of thing where I actually, again, I've removed myself from a lot of it. I just don't pay attention to it, but I did pay attention to that. And I just cannot believe that these high up officials in Phoenix PD, in the Maricopa County Attorney's Office, had recorded conversations talking about the fact that they're going to essentially make up a gang. Now, again, it pisses me off, and it's troubling, and it hurts me as a former law enforcement officer who loved my job, that wanted to do nothing but good for the public, for assholes like that to do that. I have a hard time. It's like, how am I supposed to defend law enforcement when this shit happens? How am I supposed to go out and preach, what law enforcement actually does when this is the kind of shit that higher ups are doing? And that hurts. That hurts my heart. That hurts my what I'm trying to do, not for me personally, but for law enforcement, the good ones, for the good ones that are out there that are just trying to make a difference in people's lives. that pisses me off to no fucking end. Sorry, pardon my language.
No, I mean, hell yeah, let's swear. The follow-up question then from everyone who is paying attention to this scandalized department, these two scandalized departments.
Yeah.
Can it be reformed?
I think it can, but it has to come. The problem in law enforcement is that when the boots on the ground officers don't like what the command staff is doing, they get their unions involved. The union vote of no confidence. Then they just kick the person out. So that happens quite a bit. But it's the sort of thing where you're going to need the good quality leadership to come in and change the culture. And it's very, very, very difficult. It's extremely difficult, especially when the narrative is always us against them, us against them. It's hard to change the narrative on the citizen side that it's, that these reforms are good, or these reforms are because it's us against them. And I disagree with the thin blue line as a flag and all that type of stuff. Because again, that creates a line that should not be there between law enforcement and the public.
Can you name one department that's done it?
That's doing it right currently? I do think every department has its issues.
Oh, 100%.
Nothing is perfect.
Oh, no, but what I'm arguing to you is we've been talking about reform for such a long time. Like, how long should citizens have to wait for the departments that they fund to start getting it right? Or can we start having conversations about doing things differently and creating different things? And that's kind of that's where I think the reform conversation is going to end up, because you can only say, hey, we're fixing it for so long. Like I started paying attention in the early 90s with Rodney King.
No.
Like, how long do we have to wait?
But do you think it's the majority of law enforcement or the minority that are the ones doing the corruption and that type of stuff?
I think that's an irrelevant inquiry because I think it's the structure.
Okay.
And there are those that will argue to you that it's essentially built on a foundation that is unsustainable or unjust. There'll be people who will argue to you that the essence of policing, at least in the South, when it started, was based on slave patrols. Right. And in the North, that it was based on union busting. Right. And I don't care like where you fall, right or left, like both of those, like not good. Not good. Not good things, and very much us versus them, not based on political party, but based on socioeconomic class.
A ruling class.
The haves and the have-nots, and if we use this to protect property over people, and I mean this, if we use policing to protect property over people, is that always going to be the result? And is there going to be a reform effort that changes something when the foundation is wrong? And I don't know answers to those deep questions, but like this is something that I'm constantly thinking about and trying to get as much data as I can in. And the fact that there isn't even one shining example that we can point to off the top of our heads, oh yeah, that city's really gotten it right, I think is a little telling. I think that just from personal experience where I live, and also they were very kind enough to come on my podcast. No, I do think that, again, every department has their issues, but the culture of the Pinal County Sheriff's Office from the top down is a culture of trying to engage with the community. They have the largest Instagram or social media following, and they've opened up themselves to showing the day ins and day outs. And I think that that's good for connection. Now, I can't speak as to what their actual reform is because I didn't get into those types of policy questions with Matt, with Chief Deputy Thomas. But it's the perception of the public loves them here in Pinal County. I mean, again, I had the second highest ranking of Pinal County sitting exactly where you're sitting. And a few months later, one of their deputies, and again, I'm an open cannabis consumer, and they're sitting in my house. And again, with the giant sign here to legalize that's behind us right now. Yes. And I mean, and even in the podcast with Frank, he goes, well, yeah, it's right there. I see it. And it's the sort of thing where they believe in the rule of law. So people can like or dislike Sheriff Lamb, but he believes in the people have spoken, the people have voted. That's what we're going to do. So when it comes to that, I can say that I believe that they are doing, as far as showing them and making themselves available to the public. Their deputies are like out at Country Thunder. They're people, the people love them and go up to them and take pictures and all that type of stuff. But again, as far as actual reform, I can't speak to that. And I can't point to a department saying, yep, they're doing it right. I can say
from having, and again, I'm dated, working with a bunch of different departments throughout the valley, the way that Tempe PD would handle a situation which was back then with much softer gloves, because they were usually dealing with college kids. I mean, so they had an understanding. It was a little bit more of an understanding of the people that they were serving, their community that they were serving. Whereas Phoenix PD was a little bit more heavy-handed. So again, there was not really a reason to be, but they had just chosen a different way to do things. So, but different populations, different people, different issues. But why can't we all just have a softer approach and build that trust with the community? That I don't know.
Well, and how is it when you don't have access to their data,
right,
and don't know what the day-to-day looks like, and don't have access to good, hard, audited numbers? I mean, I'd almost argue back, like the public can't know a department because they just don't know what that day-to-day looks like. That information is literally not available anywhere. And I don't know. I think that's maybe a place to start when we start talking about what reform has to look like. Now, one thing that you brought up that I'm dying to know your opinion of, because I think it's just, I know you and I got into this a little bit in the prosecutor's race, because I was trying to educate the public about the power of the prosecutor's office, and that just like in the sheriff's department or just like any police department, this is an office that has an enormous amount of discretion.
Yes.
And discretion means using your best judgment.
Yes.
It means following the law. It means that there are times where you can legally prosecute someone, but it's in the public's best interest not to.
Right.
And that our prosecutorial ethics is not just the reasonable likelihood of getting the conviction. It's also, is this a good use of public time and money?
Agreed.
And the public, I don't think, is very comfortable with this idea at all, because one of my positions was I don't think that we should be using the Maricopa County Attorney's Office to enforce a pre-statehood law. It was like an 1865 law criminalizing birth control and abortion. That's just not a good use of funds.
Right.
Bringing police and prosecutors into the into delivery rooms, into doctors' offices, like not public safety. It's also been turned on its head as you start to hear some of these constitutional sheriffs in areas where the legislature has enacted, for example, stricter gun control laws, who said that we're not going to enforce those sorts of laws. And I'm just very interested in your take on like how we educate the public about what discretion means, that this is something that is discretion, but what do we do? Because I think the public I know the left is uncomfortable with the idea of, getting a policy position that they like and not seeing it enforced. I know the right is uncomfortable with somebody openly saying that's not a good use of funds, not going to enforce that.
Right.
How do we educate people about what you and I used to do
right.
on the daily?
We had the power. I had the power on the side of the road to whether or not to charge somebody with this or that. And it is the sort of thing where I don't have a good answer, but the public needs to understand that the government has entrusted, when you were a prosecutor and I was a law enforcement officer, with having the sound mind to make these decisions, to make split-second decisions. Mine was obviously like split-second on the side of the road. Yours was through a process of coming to you, but they empowered us and they entrusted us to look at the circumstances, to look at, again, on the prosecutor side, it's about getting a conviction, and on the law enforcement side, it's about getting an arrest. But is that, is the squeeze worth the juice? Is it? And again, there's a lot of times I can sit here and think about the fact of no, this is a waste of everybody's time. But my department at the time had empowered me and entrusted me to make those decisions. Your department at that time empowered you to trust you and make those decisions. And it's about all of the stuff that the public doesn't see behind the scenes. They just hear no prosecution. You know what I mean? They don't get to see all of the stuff behind the scenes of that person also has to take care of their sick grandmother and, whatever the case may be, and all of the other stuff behind the scenes that they don't get to see, that they don't get to hear. They don't get to see the human response. And I think that discretion is the most powerful tool that law enforcement has. And again, it kind of, you got to see the forest through the trees. Okay, this person may or may not have committed a crime, but is it in fact worth following down this path of ruining their life? And are they redeemable or irredeemable? I don't know. But again, sometimes the squeeze isn't worth the juice.
And then doesn't that make every police officer its own little like policy making unit in and of themselves?
Yes and no. Yes, there are certain things that I told people that, like, look, if you get pulled over for a DUI, you're done. There's nothing that can be done. Sorry, I don't care what position that you hold, but here in the state of Arizona, you're done. But I can absolutely point to remember back to a couple of times where I had somebody had an 18, 19-year-old kid on the side of the highway for speeding, and I smelled weed in the car. And this is, again, back before even medical marijuana. And again, being here in Arizona, it was a felony. Everything here was felony.
Yep.
Is it worth ruining this kid's life for a felony? Yes, they'd probably go to task for a year and get drug tested and have it knocked down to a misdemeanor. But is it really worth that? It's the same sort of thing, though, where I can think of times where I pulled over college kids near Tempe, truck full of people all under the age of 21 drinking. Is it really worth me writing all of these tickets and getting this? They are adults for drinking, or is it just better to just make sure they get home safe? Which one's the smarter thing to do?
Right. Well, and I'll go one further. My guess is that even within your own department or even your own unit, that different people would have treated those differently.
1,000,000%. A million percent.
Isn't it also true that someone looking at this could look at this discussion that we've just had and be like, well, from this period of time, AJ Jacobs decriminalized minor in possession in these areas. And that's the part where I just really want people to understand how powerful it is. And then also how that lack of uniformity and the lack of information is corruption in and of itself. Right? When you see people who are in positions of power, who the most common one is getting caught for a DUI, who get a pass.
Right.
Right? Like somebody used their discretion to say that this one isn't worth it. That's corruption in itself. When you see that there are racial disparities in who goes to prison and who gets picked up for which crimes or who gets stopped versus our current consent order with the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department that's decades long at this point in time. That's corruption in and itself too. And where do you draw that line between what's discretion and what's corruption? And
that's a really, really hard line, because if you just make everything black and white, people that should not have been under the discretion are going to get hammered. And then people who do need to go are going to get hammered as well. But again, it's that's a great question. I'll say it again. I think discretion is the best tool that law enforcement has, because it allows them to, I don't want to say give a pass, but it does kind of allow to give a pass on certain things. And again, whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But does every kid need to be hammered for having a beer? Does every kid need to be hammered for, whatever the case is? Real tiny, quick example. I remember very, very specifically, I pulled over a dad. He's driving a beat up Lexus. It was nothing special. I pulled over a dad, and he's in workout clothes, and he's coming home. No license, no registration, whatever the case was. Pretty serious stuff regarding the civil side. And I pull him over, and I'm like, dude, you don't have this. He had a license. He didn't have registration or insurance. His registration had lapsed by a little bit, but no insurance. And I'm like, what is going on? Legally, I'm allowed to tow this car, blah, 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 blah. And he just broke down crying. He broke down crying. He was driving from the East Valley to the West Valley, and he broke down crying. I'm like, what's going on? And he goes, look, he says, my company moved me to the East Valley. I live on the far West Valley. They said, but I moved, but my company didn't move me yet. They told me they were going to by a certain date. Now I'm going through a divorce with my wife. I've got 2 kids. I can't afford this. He says, yes, I go to the gym after work because it's my only stress relief. I'm headed home. My ex-wife has my kids. I'm fighting for them, this or that. Would it have served anybody, any good if I would have written him $3,000 worth of fines and towed his car? He's driving without insurance. That's going to be on him if he gets into an accident. But it would not have served any purpose. It would have hurt those kids. It would have hurt him financially even more. That's where discretion comes in. It's the sort of thing where it's but there are some officers out there that would have hammered him, that would have towed his car, that potentially would have arrested him if he didn't have a valid license. That's where the discretion comes into play.
Yeah. I think that's exactly it. And if he was potentially a different color, there are different results in those sorts of cases, different results for people who are politically connected.
Agreed.
I don't know. This is the stuff that keeps me up at night. I don't necessarily have all the answers either,
right.
but I know that if you and I were in charge, like it would be much better.
100%. Well, and when I had the conversation with the Last Prisoner Project, I talked about the fact that why is there a disparity in minorities getting sent to prison? When, again, law enforcement is law enforcement, but then there's the other layers up the chain as well that touch the case that ultimately sends a person to prison. Why is that disparity there?
Thank you. And why won't we get the numbers so that we can see all those different instances?
Right.
So that we can dig into the why. Like, at what stage does that happen? And this is one instance where there actually, at least on the prosecution side, there are good evidence-based strategies to getting at racial disparities in policing and prosecution. And Arizona actually is home to one of the largest. We actually have a 300% overrepresentation of Black folks in our prison versus their representation in the overall population.
Okay.
And those communities that have best gotten at disparities to make the enforcement of laws more fair and just have been given access to that disaggregated data and then been able to make intelligent policy decisions based on it. For example, one of the cities that went through this sort of intentional review found that when dealing with drug crimes, that a person who was other than white, it was highly likely when they were charged, they would tack on a paraphernalia charge versus a white person, which would only have the substance charge.
Gotcha. Understood.
You and I both know how many extra years that can
and it's all felony.
All felony oftentimes can make people less eligible for diversion programs, for home detention, et cetera. And once they found that like this is one of the origination points of people being treated differently, they were able to craft a policy saying, hey, if we're charging someone with a low level possession, we're not tacking on a paraphernalia charge.
Well, and I've seen officers out on the field, you got your little thingy of rolling papers that has 30 rolling papers in it. They're like, okay, the cannabis is charge 1, and then every single one of those rolling papers is paraphernalia. That's charge 2, or that's charge 2 through 31. And then the lighter is paraphernalia, and then the baggie that the cannabis came in is another charge. So next thing you know, the person has 35 charges against them when all they had was $10 baggie of weed. That's a true. I've seen that happen before. I've also seen an officer take a Post-it note and sticky it on the ground. Again, this is pre-rec and everything now. Take a Post-it note and sticky up the shake on the floor and submit that. And then here in Arizona, it doesn't matter. There was no limit as to what the amount was.
That's right.
It's a usable quantity. It doesn't have to be defined by ounces or grams. It's a usable quantity. Well, you could take that little bit off the sticky note and smoke it, apparently, with the carpet and all the other crap in it. But
that is okay. So that expungement, not of that exact case, but of somebody doing it in an outlying county, is actually one of my favorite expungement stories.
Okay.
So we Arizona Normal went ahead and had a clinic. Actually, I don't want to say what county, but not Maricopa, not Pinell. And there was a person who came on in, and they had been charged with DUI and possession.
Okay.
And a whole bunch of paraphernalia charges stacked on top of it. And the possession was exactly that, someone taking tape to her back seat. But also, because of our plea bargaining system and because the fact that she was held pre-trial, she ended up pleading to something that she didn't do. It was leaves in her backseat. Like literally she had her backseat open, and they did not know the difference between, and there was actually cannabis in her car, but she wasn't charged for that. They didn't see the difference, and it was better for her to get out and plead to something rather than to await trial and await testing.
Right.
And that's a problem.
That's a huge problem.
Fairness problem.
That is something that has happened, is it's not worth the fight. Okay, just plead guilty to this. You'll do a couple days, whatever the case may be. Maybe you'll do a couple days in jail, or we'll plead it down, and it's not worth the fight, especially if you don't have the finances to hire your own lawyer. If you don't, and again, that also comes down to, I think, a public defender, they're overworked, they're underpaid, they just have a huge caseload and cannot devote the time and attention to one individual. So unfortunately, it comes back to underfunding. It comes back to I feel bad for public defenders. I feel bad for them for the caseload that they have to deal and not make nearly the money that their private counterparts are making.
And I have enormous respect for public defenders as well. And I think you hit it exactly on it. Like, they are so underfunded.
No.
They largely have their hands tied when it comes to advocating for policy solutions that work by virtue of their bureaucracy. We do have a liaison between, for example, all the county attorney's office and the legislature going in there saying, hey, we need these laws, make it easier for, our side to do their jobs.
Right.
And largely we don't have that, or it's been difficult to get that sort of advocacy from public defenders for a host of funding reasons. And I think that's super telling. I also think it is 100% by design. And the conversation that's going on about bail reform and how we treat individuals who aren't dangerous versus how we treat individuals who are potentially a threat to their community if they were to be released pre-trial is troubling. Like, when we kind of gave up on this idea that folks who had been charged but haven't been convicted yet are presumed to be innocent.
Right.
And instead just said, lock them all up, knowing that somebody who is detained pre-trial is far more likely to plead.
How do you balance that balancing act, though, of you hear these news stories, again, just from news media, mainstream media, and all that good stuff, hear these news stories of person commits crime, gets arrested, gets released, commits crime same day, gets arrested, gets released, where it's literally a revolving door. Or if that person is violent and then gets out and commits another violent crime, how do you balance that between the low-level person who maybe had heroin on them that is not necessarily a threat to the community? How do you balance that?
That's happening right now. Okay, so I live down the street from where that woman was murdered over at, Reach 11. But Mayo, there's a horse riding trail, and she was hiking. And
this is just a few days ago.
This is just a few days ago.
Yeah. The hiker.
Yes, the hiker. And the
I apologize for not knowing your name, but yes, I know what you're referring to.
I also apologize, and frankly, I should know her name because the accounts of what kind of person she was from her family are it's just heartbreaking, and they're doing a great job advocating for themselves. But the person who allegedly killed her had a record for what looks like to the public a bunch of horrendous offenses that were pled down to a matter of years instead of a matter of decades.
Okay.
And when I hear people talk about this case, they say that it's a failure of prosecution because the sentence should have been longer.
Okay.
And that his release is responsible for her death.
Okay.
And that seems to be like the knee-jerk media reactionary response. I would love for the response to also be like, how many more years do you need to not be violent? How many more years in a cage does it take to not produce these sorts of social harms? Like, why do we not look at those cases and be like, well, a year and a half in prison didn't work. Isn't that an indictment also?
Right.
Knowing that someone is coming in with a history of allegedly violent offenses, that this isn't working. What interventions can we do that work? Or is the answer just going to be we need to lock people up for longer? And that seems to be the policy response. Like, if only people were even more harsh and doubled down on a response that we know doesn't work, that people would be less violent. And they're never asked for the evidence behind that sort of thinking versus people who are like, oh, we want something different. Oh my gosh, like the evidence that you're required to, if you want a new policy program to help prevent, harm and violence, is just absolutely astronomical.
So again, how do you balance it? How do you keep the public safe when somebody's committed a violent crime and with the presumption of innocent until proven guilty?
Yeah. And the states that have done this the best have determined that the determination of whether or not someone stays in jail awaiting trial should be based on dangerousness, and that there's a screening device. It is very imperfect and does replicate a lot of social biases already, just to put that out there. But that assessing for dangerousness and support when they're released would be at least a better solution than using money. Because the system as it exists right now largely uses money as a surrogate for how dangerous somebody is.
Right.
And I think everybody should bristle with it. You're least dangerous if you have the most money.
Right.
Really? Like, my checkbook determines how likely I am to be violent in the interim? No, that's foolishness.
Right.
And it also isn't helpful in determining who will return. So keep in mind, the United States is almost alone in the world when it comes to using cash bail as a surrogate for somebody's safety awaiting trial. Like, There's like 2 other countries.
Okay.
And in fact, there's been large jurisdictions that have done this. One of the things that they found is they haven't found an increase in offenses while somebody has been released. And they haven't found a decrease in people returning to court on time to answer for offenses.
Regarding violent crimes?
Regarding all crimes
Okay.
and regarding money bail. So I'm
Okay.
just talking about using cash as a
Understood.
surrogate. That doesn't work.
Okay.
Let's start drilling down in what we know about dangerousness and violence to create, a way of assessing whether or not somebody can be safe. Let's not paste it on their checkbook. That doesn't work.
Right. And so do you agree, though, that there are some people that should not be let out pre-trial?
Oh, 100%.
Okay.
100%. I don't think that our current metrics do that.
I agree.
And they create this, they replicate a lot of these privilege issues too, because the people who have the most money, like let's talk about the people who potentially, where there's at least some anecdotal evidence that they shouldn't be released pre-trial. So somebody, for example, who would be likely to tamper with witnesses or tamper with evidence. And I can think of a couple high-profile Chicago cases that I was on. Person was released, evidence was tampered with, but they were released they were released because they could afford to post that giant bond.
Whether it's $2 million, whatever the case is.
And they believed that they were unaccountable.
Right.
That it wasn't going to matter to them. So I just don't like using poverty as as a reason to detain.
I agree with that statement. I agree with that assessment. And I can sit with the law enforcement side and agree with them, and I can sit with the not law enforcement side and agree with that as well. And it's hard to have that balance but there are some people that should not be let out pre-trial. Do we agree that there are some people that are just criminals? Whether or not, let me preface it like this. They did not grow up to be wanting to be criminals. They did not have aspirations to be criminals. I'm not saying that, but at some point in their life, they've hit a point where they're just criminals, and going back to the whole redeemable, irredeemable. That's not what I'm saying, but in the moment, do we agree that there are some people that are just so violent that something has to happen because they're just a danger to society? I'm interested on your take on that.
I can agree that there are some people, by virtue of their history, that you can look at, and it's highly predictive that somebody will hurt the community.
Right.
Like that. Yes, I agree with you on that. Where I bristle, and maybe that's where you see me like sitting around and shifting, is I don't like this idea that we have that certain people are just criminals. I think that idea is super dehumanizing. It doesn't recognize that every moment above ground is a moment that you could use toward personal transformation. It's one of the reasons why I don't think, for example, life without parole for crimes committed as a juvenile are evidence-based or a good idea. Like having people account for something that happened before their brains were even fully developed.
Agreed.
Yeah, that's not great. So I'd rather have a system that errs on the side of individualized evaluation of where they are and the potential risk going into the community, that uses like actual real data and is constantly reevaluated, than making these sorts of like blanket statements. Understood.
The hard part from the law enforcement side is, again, when they're dealing with the same person over and over and over and over again.
Right.
That's where the juxtaposition comes in. It's like, but Jesus, this person isn't doing anything but crime after crime after crime after crime, whether it's low level crime or, home invasions or whatever the case may be. That's the perception.
Well, I think that's really fair. Like that there are folks who are arrested over and over and over again, and the only option that we as a society have given to police and prosecutors is prison,
incarceration. And
we know that upon release, like our recidivism rates are through the roof. So we've handed people an option that we know doesn't help, that may actually harm more. Yeah. And the only option you have is to do it harder.
And it's going to just create the same outcome. They're just going to continue to, it boils back down to the question. Let's take somebody who is, for lack of a better term, a hardened criminal by the time they're 25 years old. They're a gang member. They grew up, in the worst part of town. They were a drug dealer, gang member, and all that. I'm going extreme on this case. How do you rehabilitate that person?
Yeah.
That's again, I don't believe that anyone as a child wanted to become a criminal. I don't believe that at all. I don't believe that, I believe that somewhere along the way something happened. How do you now reform that person who's in that life?
Yeah. And I mean, the crux of it is, I think that the underlying premise to your question is, can you reform someone who doesn't want to change? And does that person want to change? And when you tell that story, it makes me think of my friend Garrett Dietz. He is self-described as that. He was affiliated with gangs. He was in and out of prison constantly. He made an intentional choice to change, and he now leads one of the parole reentry groups in town, and is one of the leaders in Arizona when it comes to treatment upon release from prison.
I'd love to talk to him.
You should have Garrett. I'd
love to talk to him.
Yeah, and on top of being like just a fascinating human, and just so you get the picture, I mean, last time I saw Garrett, shaved head, tattoos everywhere. The man is a teddy bear.
Gotcha.
I would trust him babysitting my children. And his story is one of, anybody else would have classified him as that hardened person. So, I mean, I agree. I think there are ways to assess danger and harm to the community without throwing people away.
I agree, but it takes funding.
It takes funding. It takes so much
Experts.
compassion. It takes thinking outside the box and not throwing people away. Which is why one of the things that I aim for, you almost never will hear me say the word criminal. Like anything that reduces a human to the single worst thing that they've ever done in their life, like, no, it's not acknowledging somebody's humanity. And I know that makes people, especially law enforcement, bristle, because we're literally enculturated to talk about we are the good that stands in the way of the bad.
Right.
And the more humans that I meet and the more people that I talk to and the more that I evaluate, the cases that I worked on as a prosecutor and some of the convictions I've expunged, now the more gray area that I see.
I agree with that, but I also do believe that there are people who want to do harm to individuals. There are people out there in society that want to prey upon our weak.
100%.
And that's the hard part is, again, I don't think that they grew up wanting to do those things, whether it's through embezzling money, whether it's through active shooters and that type of thing, whatever the case is. But that's where we are protecting them, or us from them on the law enforcement side of the house. I'm not speaking for all law enforcement, but there is that divide that is ingrained in the culture of those are just criminals. Those are just scumbags. Those are just bad guys. 100% that is there.
Can I suggest to you?
Of course.
I don't think that that's happening.
Okay. I'd like to hear that.
Yeah. All right. So one of the things that has been brought up from a bunch of different community groups that I've been out to is especially the police and prosecutors' response to sexual assault in our community.
Okay.
And their specific issue is that they don't believe that folks who are actually harming people are ever involved in the system. And the evidence that they're suggesting is what they start with. And we've already talked about how crime rates and reporting are so substantially off.
Right.
But using clearance rates as a metric for whether or not that's happening. So, for example, in the city of Phoenix, we have one of the lowest sexual assault clearance rates in the nation.
Okay.
It's just north of 9%.
And when you're talking clearance rates, you're talking about law enforcement gets the report, law enforcement does the investigation, law enforcement arrests a suspect, and then the person gets prosecuted.
I'm not even talking the prosecution unit. I'm just talking that the case is cleared and sent to the county attorney to be charged.
Okay. So you're the follow through with on the law enforcement side.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And if you talk to especially young women in our community, I was shocked hearing this from the mouths of some of my very good friends at ASU, is that they recognize that if they were to report, that 9 times out of 10, it's not going to be prosecuted. They're putting themselves through this like traumatic experience, and it's not even going to result in an arrest. And then when you look at the prosecution rates and how many folks actually ended up having a guilty verdict or plea at the end of the day, it ends up being at 2% out of the city of Phoenix.
Why is it so low?
Thank you. So here's what I'm suggesting.
Okay.
Like when we start talking about people who are harming other people, it is not the case right now that those cases are given the priority, that they are investigated to clearance, and that they are prosecuted. And you'll see some of those. Then that is, to be fair, I am cherry picking one specific statistic.
But that's what we got.
Well, City of Phoenix, City of Scottsdale, it's at 25% clearance rates. Like they're low across the nation, but they're also low on violent crime. Like when you think about murder clearance rates, like the City of Phoenix has actually stepped up their murder clearance rate, is now sitting just north of 2/3 of the homicides that are reported end up in an arrest and end up being cleared. But I think if the average human understood that 1 out of 3.
That's not good. Is it a lack of resources on the law enforcement side?
Well, that's what I want to be able to drill down to, because we don't have enough, we the public don't have enough information to make those sorts of determinations. Is it that these other trespass cases are being prioritized because they're really easy? Tell someone to go away or we're going to book you for a low-level misdemeanor? Is it because forensics are lacking? Is it, are we seeing these low rape clearance rates because of a cultural issue with believing victims and this idea of what makes somebody believable? Is it the fact that we had that giant rape clearance kit issue for decades that's now almost up to date? Like I think that when we talk about like violence and harm, like the public needs a big picture.
The one thing that I can speak with authority on is the fact that I was stationed with the Phoenix PD Homicide Unit, and the Phoenix PD Homicide Unit. So we've criticized Phoenix PD, and now I'm actually going to praise them. One of the things that astonished me, there was this one particular murder that they had nothing to go on, and by the end of the day, we were arresting somebody. But the problem that when it comes to defunding the police and all that type of stuff, the thing that happens though is that patrol is the last thing to be touched when it comes to a law enforcement agency. Patrol is the priority. Being out there, a uniform presence in a patrol car responding to actual 911 calls is the priority. The back end, the patrol usually gets the least money, but has the highest priority, where the detectives get more money, but have the lowest priority. So when defunding happens or staffing shortages happen, it's detectives that are taken out of their detective role and put back into a patrol role. So now this detective who had 2 armed robberies and 3 break-ins or whatever the case is can't work those cases because now they've been moved out of being a detective and put back into patrol. So now there's a deficit on the detective side for the follow-through, for the investigation. That's why things can sometimes take months and months and months, or not even at all. So when it comes to that, this is my personal belief, we need more. We need better. I've always said a million times, I don't want less cops. I want better cops. I want smarter. I want better trained. I want, on the mental health side, I want them in the best possible mental health that they can be in to make the best decisions, to be able to react the best to the public, not having all cops have PTSD. All firefighters have PTSD. All sexual assault prosecutors have PTSD. You know what I mean? It's the sort of thing where that's an epidemic. But on the, like I said, on the frontline law enforcement side, I want them to be as mentally clear as possible. But when funding happens and staffing shortages happen, it's the detectives that get pulled and get put back in a uniform. So that could potentially, I'm just making I'm not making an excuse here. I'm just giving a potential reason why, because I worked on the detective or on the homicide floor with Phoenix PD as a homicide detective, and it was right next to the robbery guys as well. And I saw them working, you know what I mean? So why is the clearance rate so low? That I can't answer, but.
Well, and I think that those are questions that should be asked, because the answer when it comes to resources is always more. Right. And then the question I think needs to be had, like, well, how much is enough and what are the priorities? And I mean, I've seen it firsthand too. So I did a lot of work with the cold case unit in Cook County. And that was actually a relatively new unit that was put there. I think it was only like 5 prosecutors at the time. And yeah, they didn't, before then, it wasn't a priority to open these cases that had been, pending for 20 plus years. Right. And I think that any sort of budget is a moral document. It says, these are our intentions. This is where we're going to be putting our focus. And because we keep on coming back to the elephant in the room is police funding.
Yes.
And talking about like what is an efficient division of resources and how is that money being used now? And my only suggestion that I think that would be so helpful in public discourse is like, how is it being used now?
How is it being used?
Give us the data. Show us the data. I don't need people to come out and say that everybody's doing a great job or, a few bad apples or any of this other, like these taglines. That doesn't get the job done. Like, tell us how you're using public money now, and let's make sure that that's in line with the public priorities.
Amen. I agree with that 100%.
And I think if you were to survey the public, they would come back and say, no, the public priorities are instances of violence, crimes that target women, children, and our seniors. And I think the public still cares about financial crime and public corruption.
Right. Which is hilarious because, the white collar crimes can impact way more people's lives, especially financially, obviously, and sometimes get the lowest sentence because they're usually the ones with money.
Oh, another thing I'm going to get in trouble with, but like the county attorney's office, I do believe that financial crime needs to be prosecuted. And it is actually the largest amount of theft comes through financial crime, most of which being wage theft. And that is something that the average member of the public should care about.
Okay.
In fact, that's 3/4 of the theft that we see out of the economy every single year. And the way to do it right is to have agencies that are able to prosecute across jurisdictions and to do it well and do it in a way that's interdisciplinary. So, my background and training is that I was actually brought up by the prosecutor that wrote the RICO Act.
Okay.
And he was, went after the mob.
Yeah.
I was on the study that kind of showed what influence it had to be able to bring in, all these co-defendants in a diverse criminal conspiracy and prosecute them as one crime family.
I forget what RICO stands for.
It's the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organization Act.
Gotcha. It's where you can, for those who don't know, it's where you can rope people in that had something to do with the organized crime. It allows you to stop me along the way and correct me when I'm wrong.
You're getting it.
You own, it's a way to get the tentacles out and touch everything that touched the organized crime.
That's exactly right. And what you're looking for in a RICO prosecution, which, there's a federal RICO statute, I think 18 U.S.C. 1964, but there are also state RICO RICO acts. And what you're looking for is racketeering activity, which can be everything from, violence, murder, which is a tool of organized crime, to, complex financial theft. You're looking for a pattern. And then most importantly, you're looking for an organization that is doing this as a business, not like as an LLC. You don't have to be incorporated, but that has a profit, because that's what really makes organized crime so dangerous and so different from street crime. And before we had RICO, the public's view and the law's view of crime was very much that of, a single stick up on a single day, and it gets prosecuted as a single street crime, versus an organization that's made up of people, that maybe has a hierarchy where people don't even know each other, and that you could even have corporate entities being indicted under a RICO type offense.
For money laundering and the fronts.
Yeah, the front, and that was coupled with more innovative criminal legal system ideas like having witness protection, because and you and I have disagreed on this before, but one thing that is highly effective in financial crime is taking one of those low-level players and flipping them.
Yes.
That is absolutely key. And I don't believe that is as effective when it comes to drug crime, but we've had that talk before. And that you get these prosecutions via having tapped phones,
yes,
people wearing bugs, having informants. These are large-scale investigations.
Title IIIs.
Thank you. Yes. Which, by the way, just in Illinois, just so you know, only the feds were allowed to use Title IIIs.
Interesting. Because
the state legislature didn't want to be investigated.
Oh, yeah. That's a way to silence your people.
Yeah, no kidding. But anyway, my point on all of this is
wiretaps, Title III or wiretaps, electronic wiretaps.
You need to have organizations within every single state that are willing to hold state actors accountable.
Yeah.
And that has traditionally been state prosecutors working in tandem with federal authorities. And in my view, Arizona really just hasn't engaged in those sorts of prosecutions or even investigations. I think there's some really good reasons for that, but one of the reasons is the lack of person power inside the county attorney's office devoted to it. A while back, it was like 8 full-time equivalents. It ended up getting cut to 2 part-time equivalent prosecutors doing that kind of work. You also see it in the kinds of laws that they're allowed to enforce. Like we've seen the gutting of public corruption laws in the last decade. Why. Yeah.
Gosh, I wonder why. Who writes those laws? I wonder
who writes
why
those
the public
opinions
ones. Yeah.
And who are they taking money from?
Right.
No, my favorite. I love talking about the honest services fraud cases. You remember those? It was like Conrad Black was involved with one of them. Jeff Skilling from Enron was involved in one of them. But my absolute favorite one is this guy named Bruce Wyrek, and he was an Alaskan legislator.
Okay.
And he was outgoing. But while he was outgoing, he was voting on all of this legislation that would have given billions in kickbacks and subsidies to the oil companies.
Yeah, they need more money, clearly.
I mean, I don't know too much about Alaskan politics, but yes, sarcasm will appreciate it.
Yes.
What he didn't tell his constituents and what he didn't tell anybody as he was taking these votes was that he had employment lined up for when he left the legislature with the oil company.
Of course.
So he was indicted for honest services fraud, which is one of the chief ways the federal government would go after corrupt public officials and frankly, private people who are defrauding investors as well. Like honest services could run both ways. And Bruce Wyrek successfully defended his case and overturned his conviction at the Supreme Court level by arguing that no reasonable public official could know the difference between honest services and dishonest services.
I don't even know what to say about that. How do you, I mean, that goes basic, children know right and wrong, honest and dishonest.
Not according to the Supreme Court.
That's insane.
It is insane. And like since and what the holding in the Wyrek, Skilling, Conrad Black like trilogy of cases ended up saying was that anything short of a quid pro quo bribe was not going to be considered fraud under federal law. So what they successfully did was take away prosecutors' only way of holding officials accountable for everything short of, you know, give me money and I'll give you my vote.
Right. So that still holds true to today.
Still to today, that honest services is so severely curtailed that it essentially can't be prosecuted. It's just another bribe. And that's one of the things that you see in Arizona as well. Like we have this rule of 10, and the rule of 10 says that it is not a conflict of interest to vote on legislation that you have a direct financial benefit from, provided that at least 10 other people were doing it.
Yeah, we've never seen this in. Anyways.
So the way it ended up playing out to all of the school children's detriment is when we talk about the other education grift, which was the student tuition assistance organizations that allow a dollar for dollar tax credit of private people's funds that end up going into private schools.
Okay.
So you're essentially subsidizing parochial education with this. And the then president of the Senate was the president of the biggest student tuition assistance organization that was getting 10% of all these funds.
This just was very recently, within the last few years.
This is like 6 years ago is when this is like starting to boil over.
I remember this.
ESAs have like largely dwarfed the amount of, corruption involved in this program. But he was allowed to vote on that legislation that directly benefited him in that expansion because there were 11 people doing it.
How do you prevent corruption when the system itself is set up to allow for corruption?
System is operating exactly as it's intended to benefit the people who are already in power, who already have the money.
I think that this goes back to the statement of, again, I don't mean to get too political. Obviously, this whole thing's been political. Right. But to go back
mere existence is political in these days, yes.
To go back to, do you remember the Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton debate where Donald Trump was, it's all rigged. I know it's rigged because I use it. And it's those people that rigged it, and they're using the system as well. They rigged the system, they're using the system, and they're not going to change it. Why would they change it if they're going to continue to use the system and make millions and hundreds of millions of dollars off of United States citizens, the taxpayers, the people?
Yep. Our money, and it's being spent on political nepotism. Yeah. And I don't want to tell you, like, so first of all, two things. My new pet peeve: everything is political. Political literally means like polis of the life of the people.
Everything is politicized.
No, everything has always been political. Even art and literature has always been political. It doesn't need to be partisan.
Okay.
And
Agreed.
I think that's
I'll agree with that statement.
The part where I just want to keep on redirecting people back. Like, yeah, it's all political. Don't tell me like something is politicized. It's always been this way. But it doesn't have to be like along strict party lines.
Right.
And yeah, the corruption knows no party. Like, this is just about sheer power.
And again, that's where I wish people would stop saying, the left would stop saying the right's doing this, and I wish the right would stop saying the left is doing this. I love the quote of the left and the right are part of the same bird. It's the left wing and the right wing are all part of the same bird. It's like it's the same thing. Everyone's doing it for their own personal gain.
Yeah. And meanwhile, everybody at the bottom is getting screwed.
Everybody. I don't have an answer. It's really frustrating. It's disgusting. It's frustrating. It needs to be called out. It needs to be called out at all levels, whether you're, again, I'm Republican. If there's a terrible Republican doing something terrible, call their asses out. If you're a Democrat and there's a terrible Democrat doing something terrible, call their asses out. It should be brought to the forefront. That's my personal opinion.
I wish it worked that way.
I know, but people are scared.
Yeah, I think people are really scared. Like they get so right now we're sitting in a situation with divided government, right? And I think that a lot of Dems, like the scuttlebutt that I'm hearing, is that they are very afraid of any sort of political retribution from the people in charge.
Okay.
And that it's really difficult to speak out and stay true to their values because we have this system that relies on relationships, that allows people this discretion to grant favors to the people they like. And yeah, it's really difficult for accountability.
That's the very antithesis of the First Amendment. The whole, and I think that it's important for people to also understand too that the Constitution is put in place to limit the government. It's not to limit the people's rights. It's to limit the government. And we should have free speech without fear of retribution. If you say something stupid and your private company does whatever, that's a private individual. But we should be able to sit here and not have to worry about political prosecution or, oh, Julie said this, so we're not going to allow her to do that. Even if it's not on the prosecution side, but simply on the, just because you disagree. I enjoy having conversations with people I disagree with because it opens up the communication and it opens up and allows for common ground. But when you're exposing people that are hiding shit, they don't like that very much.
No, not at all. Not at all. So yeah, don't have any great solutions there, except I'm just going to keep doing the same thing because there are ways to work outside of the system in ways that actually are power building and are meaningful. And I think that's one of the great things that Arizona Normal has put together, like a true coalition of consumers.
I'm a dumbass. I didn't wear my normal shirt. I should have worn my normal shirt.
Yeah, what the hell, AJ?
I know.
It's lovely though. I like the elf shirt. No, like we've kicked ass at that, frankly. Bringing together.
You guys have. Like I said, I've been out of it just for a little bit. I'm still on the board, but I'm still there, but I'm not there right now because of my back issues. But you have been a driving force. John Udell, huge shout out to John.
John's amazing.
Yeah, the current board is amazing right now. And again, I'm not singling anybody out. Everybody is amazing. And the power, I use the term power, but the abilities of Arizona Normal that has happened in the last 2 years is pretty astonishing. It's pretty astonishing. It's pissed a lot of people off.
It's pissed a lot of
which
people
which has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, who would have thought? Like, just to have you talked about the history of Arizona Normal?
Not specifically, no, not on the podcast at all. No.
Well, Michael Weiser,
Yep.
as you know, was a friend, and I used to see Michael all the time when I was down at the Capitol doing education work. And the thing that was so great about that man is he would talk your ear off. Like, he didn't even have to know you.
Right. Agreed.
So you'd step into the elevator. The man reeked of cannabis. And he's like, let me tell you about your endocannabinoid system. And I'm like, yeah, okay, science me up, Michael. Like, let's talk. And he was always so charming, but he was really good at building relationships.
He was I had the privilege of knowing him for about a year. I collected signatures with him for Prop 207. So I did have the privilege of getting down there and to see him work.
And my perception of the way he works, I know that this was how he dealt with me when I was a candidate, was it just always came back to, let's talk about the plant. Let's talk about decrim. Let's like keep it on this policy stream. Let's do it in this like educational and joyful way. And that model works. And that's what why we've been so successful in the last 2 years at Power Building. Like, even though we had this devastating loss in May, so he didn't even get to witness the fruits of all of his labor for legalization in Arizona, that we had, we have a real voice now at the legislature, that we've brought together people from all political leanings, and it's all just based on advocacy for the plant.
Yep.
What does it look like to be fair to consumers? And I think that's going to be a really big story to tell in the coming years, because I think everybody thought that Arizona Normal was out of the equation once our Prop 207, our responsible adult use, passed. And it turns out, as you and I know, that 207 was like the start. There's still so much more that we need to do to clean up the industry, to make sure that there's not corruption and regulatory capture, that we have equitable processes, that we keep the cost low for consumers, we make sure the medicine is safe. There's so much out there.
So on that note, what time did you have to leave by?
Oh, like 1 o'clock.
Holy shit. It's 1 o'clock. We have taken a ton of time.
I talked your ear off.
No.
Enjoy you, though. I'm glad we got to have this talk.
I want to keep going, but I don't want to. I didn't even realize it was we've been going over this for over 2 hours. There's so much more to talk about.
Well, I tell you what, why don't we make this a thing? As much as your viewers will tolerate me, I'll just come back whenever. I know where you live.
I would absolutely. I've been wanting to do that with you for a while. I've been wanting to. I would love to also. And again, I'm 24 days and a wake up away from my spine surgery. So, and that was sort of the thing where it's like, I was hoping that I'd be able to. I think you're going to be the last one until my surgery, because I've got to finish the editing the previous one and then obviously this one. But I've been wanting to do this and sit down, because I think we have a good thing. I think we can talk through things. So I'd love to make it a regular thing, or whatever the case may be, and continue this conversation, because there's like so much more shit I want to talk about. Like, we're not even at the tip of the iceberg yet.
Yeah, we've only solved about 5% of the problems. Like, there's a whole world out there. Yeah, hit me up and know that on behalf of all your listenership and viewership, we're all rooting for you in the surgery, man. Like,
I appreciate that.
Go heal, get better.
And that's kind of the thing, is I wanted to get some under my belt so I can, while I'm sitting there doing nothing and staring at the ceiling, I could edit stuff and get it out there. But yeah, no, I said I got like a million things to talk about.
Well, let's do this again sometime.
Okay. All right, let's call this a wrap, and then we'll do it again soon.
You got it.
Awesome. Thanks, Julie. Thank you,
You're so
everyone.
welcome. Thank you, everyone.